My guest is Keith Whitley, who had that record a while back with Miami.
My Amy loves me after all.
Miami, my Amy loves me after all.
Very good, Ralph.
#1 record for you.
Well, it actually wasn't, but a lot of folks would argue with you and say that it was. It did about all the things for me that a #1 record will do. I still haven't had a #1 record yet. We've been lucky enough to have had 4 hit records in a row, but we're still looking for our first #1.
Well, in case you're new to a lot of our listeners, in many cases it takes a while for people to catch on to who's singing which songs.
It sure does.
So let's review your hits so far.
Well, Miami, Miami was my first hit record. Our next record after that was 10 Feet Away, which became a top 10 record for us. Homecoming 63 was our next record, another top 10. And then our latest record, Hard Living, which was also a top 10 record for us.
So 4 releases?
4 in a row.
And 4 in the top?
Well, there were 2 releases before Miami hit that charted and I think got in the 50s and 60s.
What were they?
My first record for a major label was a song called Turn Me to Love, which came out in the fall of 1985, and it was produced by Nora Wilson and on my first little mini LP for RCA. And it got to, I think, 51. My second record was a song called A Hard Act to Follow, which was the title of the mini LP, and it got in the 50s and 60s also.
So after the first 2, you then hit 4 top 10 records in a row.
Right.
Life has been good.
Life has been great. It's better than I ever imagined it could be.
Do some people think you are a bluegrass singer?
There's a little bit of a misconception there because a lot of people think that I'm a bluegrass singer turned country singer.
Is that true?
No, it's actually the other way around. I'm a country singer who spent about 4 or 5 years in bluegrass music, primarily as a way to get in a band. When I was 12, 13 years old, I really had a strong desire to be a member of a band. And I had played country music from the time I was about 4 and 5 years old and started performing at local talent contests, and I did some radio and TV around Huntington, Charleston, West Virginia. The old Buddy Starcher Show was the first TV show I ever appeared on. And I was a traditional country singer, pretty much the same type of music that I do now. But there were I lived in a real rural part of the country, and there were no steel players, and there were no drummers, and no country musicians at that time, but there were a lot of really good bluegrass bands, and my brother had a bluegrass band. And as a way to get in a band, I started working with his band and learned to love the music. We had a local radio show on WGOH radio in Grayson, Kentucky, and I became quite a bluegrass fan. We did, I think, probably, I would say 90% Stanley Brother material at that time. And Ricky Scaggs and I met shortly after that, and he joined our band, and that's how we became acquainted. We worked a little contest in Ezell, Kentucky, and I was playing with my brother in the band, and Ricky was in the fiddle contest with his father.
How did you and Ricky Scaggs meet?
We grew up in eastern Kentucky. We were born and raised in eastern Kentucky.
Did you know him when you were little boys?
Well, I had heard of Ricky. I used to have a little rock and roll band, and we played a lot of high school dances and things like that. And Ricky had a rock and roll band, and I heard some tapes of him playing. At that time, he was playing guitar, and he was a really good player. Even back that long ago, we were like 13, 14 years old, or maybe younger at that time. But we hadn't met at that time. When I was about 14. I think Ricky would have been 14 or 15, somewhere thereabout. We played a contest in Ezell, Kentucky, which is also in eastern Kentucky. And I was in the band contest, and Ricky was in the fiddler's contest. He had just taken up fiddle, I think, not more than 7 or 8 months before that. And he held it down real low in his arm. He didn't hold it up under his chin, but he was already playing really well at that time. So he won the fiddle contest, I think, and we got to talking afterwards. We liked a lot of the same type music. We really were big Stanley Brother fans at that time. So he invited my brother and I over to his parents' house the next week, and we just hit it off from the very start. And so within a month from that time, Ricky was working in the band with my brother and myself, and then that led to our meeting Ralph Stanley, and we became members of Ralph's band within, I think, 6 months of that time.
You played in your brother's band, and Ricky did as well.
Right.
What kind of band was that?
It was a bluegrass band. It was called the Whitley Brothers. and we had a radio show on WGOH radio in Grayson, Kentucky.
All right. Now, the night Ricky Scaggs appeared in the fiddle contest, you were in that contest as well?
No. We, as I said, had a radio show, so we were considered professionals at that time. So we were just more or less a guest band. There were several bands that performed, and then there was another segment, kind of a separate thing that was a contest for individual musicians.
You were 14 and considered a professional?
Yeah. I was considered a
How much money were you making on that radio station?
I was making very little, Ralph. We didn't make any money, actually, for the show. I also had a TV show that was on once a month on a little station in Hazard, Kentucky, a UHF station that was sponsored by an automobile dealership. So once a month when we would go up to do that show, they would furnish us a car, a station wagon, to ride up in and buy us all dinner on the way back. So that was my income at that time. But that was a big treat for a 14-year-old kid.
Now, you were still in school.
Oh, yes.
When you joined Ralph Stanley and his bluegrass band, I assume school was a problem.
School, you might say, was always a problem for me. I don't know. I was intelligent enough to do well in school without trying very hard, is what it boils down to. I've always had a good memory, and that's helped me a lot with song lyrics. And I didn't have to apply myself very much in school, and I must say that I was not very interested in school at that time, and there were more important things on my mind.
Keith, I'm sure that the fans of Keith Whitley and Ricky Scaggs have wondered, since you were two of the young Turks who came out of bluegrass music and became successful in country music, have wondered why you didn't get back together again and do an LP and sing together again as you used to. I think you recorded for Sugar Hill Records alone?
Ricky recorded for Sugar Hill after he and I had made our two albums together. The two albums we did, the first one was on J. Lynn Records out of Dayton, Ohio, and the second one was on Rebel Records, which is the label that Ralph Stanley still records on.
All right, are these items still available, or are they out of print?
Someone bought the master of our first album and re-released it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's on Gusto Records now, so you can get it, but you can't get the second one.
Okay, what did you sing on those albums?
The first album was called Keith Whitley, Ricky Scaggs, Tribute to the Stanley Brothers. So it was...
you sang their songs?
Yeah, entirely Stanley Brother material. The second album was called Second Generation Bluegrass. It had some new songs and some old songs. It was a mixture.
All right, Ricky is at CBS, you are at RCA. Of course, that doesn't slow Willie Nelson down.
No.
The fact that you're on different labels shouldn't be a problem. Have you talked about doing an album together?
We've not really talked about an entire album. We've talked a lot about doing some recording together, and Ricky did in fact come in and sing harmony with me and play both mandolin and fiddle on a song that I had recorded for what was to be my last album, and that's the album that we wound up not releasing. But it came off great. It was like it's the first time we'd sung together in probably 10 years, at least the first time we'd been in the studio in 10 years. And well, it was just great to sing together again. So hopefully down the road we'll get to do something like that. I would certainly welcome the opportunity, and he's expressed the same opinion on several occasions when I've heard people ask him about it. So hopefully we'll get to do that.
You told me that you first went on stage at 4?
4 years old.
Was this in an amateur show of some kind?
It was in a 4-H talent contest in Sandy Hook, Kentucky, and that's the first performing that I did was in contests like that.
I'm visiting with Keith Whitley, who records for the folks at the Little Dog label, the Nipper label, RCA, and he's married to a very beautiful country singer by the name of Lorrie Morgan. Got married when?
Got married November 22nd of last year.
And now you have a little baby.
We sure do have a brand new baby boy, Jesse Keith Whitley.
And this has really caused a change in your life, hasn't it?
It sure has. This is the first time that I never even wanted children before. I've always liked children, but I never considered myself I don't guess I was ever really ready to settle down enough to have children.
You didn't think you were father material?
I never did, really, Ralph. I've always been good with children, and children, for some reason or other, always seemed to like me. And my family always used to say, well, you'd make a great daddy. But I never thought seriously about it until Lorrie and I met. And then something happened, and we wanted a child from the very start. And we wanted a boy really bad. Both of us wanted a boy. And it's just... It's funny, it's almost like we ordered him, We kept talking about how he was going to look and what his name was going to be, even before, we found out she was pregnant. And we called him Jesse. It had always been a name I'd liked. And we said he'll probably have red hair, which he does. My mama has red hair. And it's just like we sat down and ordered him. And God must have heard us talking, because he sent him to us pretty much like we wanted him.
Have you learned to do all those baby things?
I'm pretty good at it. I must say, I'm changing diapers, and I'm heating up his formula, mixing his cereal, and I try to take as much of a part in that as I can when I'm home, because Lorrie has to do it all when I'm gone.
You burp him?
That's the one thing that I'm not real good at, and sometimes he makes a lot of little noises, and I can't really tell if he's burped or not. So that area gives me a little problem.
You sing to him, rock him?
I do that a lot. Yeah, I do that a lot. My mom tells me all the time that when she used to sing to me when I was little, and I learned to sing at a real early age, that I would request the songs that I liked, and she'd start singing them, and when she'd get a little way into the song, I'd put my hand over her mouth, and I'd take over. So I guess Jesse may take after me.
So he comes by this quite honestly.
He sure does.
How long did you know Lorrie Morgan before you married her?
I guess I knew Lorrie probably about three and a half years. I met her the first recording that I did after coming to Nashville. This was the first year I was in town, 1983. 1983 or 1984. I was in the studio over at Acuff Rose doing some overdubs on a session that Don Gant produced on me, which kind of led to my deal with RCA. And I met Lorrie in the studio that night, and we just talked real briefly. And I had gone through a divorce from my first wife before that. Lorrie and I got reacquainted the first time I did the Opry after having Miami as a record. And she came up to me that night and reintroduced herself to me, and we started dating immediately after that.
You mentioned you were in the studio last night. I know you have a new album coming out. And this album features guest performances, doesn't it?
It sure does. And we didn't start out that way. The way it all came about, we recorded a song that was written by Hank Cochran, who is legendary in this business, and he wrote my first hit, Miami, Miami. He had co-wrote a song with Red Lane and Vern Gosdin and sent the song to me, and it's absolutely a beautiful ballad called Would These Arms Be in Your Way. And when we were in the studio cutting the tracks on the song, my producer, Blake Mevis, said it would be neat to have Vern Gosdin sing harmony on the record, because he's a co-writer and Blake produced some of Vern's biggest hits. And I've been thankful. RCA for some time had wanted me to do something with Emmylou, because I found out, much to my surprise, that she had been a fan of mine for a lot of years. So I knew Vern and Emmylou worked together on several occasions, so I thought it would just be a natural thing to do. So we had the pleasure of having Vern and Emmylou sing harmony on the new record. And it was really neat. They just did a super job, and they really added a lot to the record, I think. And it's my brand new record that just came out this week.
And the title is?
Would These Arms Be in Your Way.
All right. Now, as they hear this, it will have been out for several weeks.
Oh, that's right.
Okay. Now, in your album, who else makes guest appearances?
To this point, we have Earl Thomas Conley and I doing a duet together of a real beautiful song called Brotherly Love. Ricky Scaggs and I teamed up again for the first time in about 16 years and did a beautiful, almost a bluegrass song called Till Each Tear Becomes a Rose. Ricky's playing fiddle and mandolin and singing high harmony on it with me.
Now, you say up until this time.
Well, there's a couple more people that may or may not be on the album.
The album is not completed, as
the album is not
told.
completed. I have my part. I just completed my part last night. There's plans to have a couple more folks guest star on the album, and it's not really definite yet. Record labels, sometimes there's a little problem there.
Who are the folks that you're trying to get?
Hank Williams Jr. and Merle Haggard.
Now, this album you're putting together, when do you hope to market this album?
The album will be out in September.
You better hurry.
Yeah, we're at a deadline on this other thing, kind of, and we're waiting on word from Hank. I wrote a song that, the people who have guest starred on this album, it's not just that we sat down and, and said, hey, I want to do a song with Emmylou Harris and Vern Gosdin. It really worked out. It was real special. And the Brotherly Love song, the duet with Earl Thomas Conley, I was planning to record that song before I had any, I never thought about doing a duet. And when we were going over material with Joe Galante and Blake and I, Joe said, have you ever thought about doing this as a duet? And the first thing that popped in my mind when he said duet was a male-female duet. And I said, well, what kind of duet you got in mind? He said, well, maybe with another artist on the label. And when he mentioned Earl, we've kind of had a little running joke going back and forth for about the past year or so, because several people seem to think that we resemble a little bit. And then I've always closed my shows by saying, if you like me, I'm Keith Whitley, and if you don't, I'm Earl Thomas Conley.
I see. I am reading from Billboard magazine, Jerry Wood's column, when he predicts that Keith Whitley, who ended 1988 in the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot Country Singles Chart, will continue his dramatic career rebound. What does he mean by that? Now, I realize he's predicting good things for you, but what does he mean, rebound?
Well, Ralph, we had our first hit record in 1986 with Miami, Miami, and then we followed that up with a couple of records that did real well. And then we had a little dry spell for probably 8 or 9 months where one of my records stopped at 30, and then we made a production change, and so we went without a record for a little while. So this day and time, it seems like it's getting more and more like the old saying, you're only as good as your last record. So we noticed a little slip in our box office and sales and things like that for a while. So I guess by that, this is kind of a comeback or a rebound for us.
Now, a lot of young singers would accept 30 as a step up. In your opinion, how high does a record have to go before it's considered to be a hit, a bona fide hit?
Well, I believe that a number 30 record for some artists would be, a great
disaster.
Yeah, exactly. And number 30 for some other artists would be a very successful record. I think.
But according to the people you deal with, what do they consider a hit?
I think a top 10 record.
Has to get into the top 10.
I think so.
That's what they would like for you to do every time out.
Exactly, every time out. And it has to sell. You can have a record that does real well with radio, as I'm sure you know, and you may not sell. We had one a couple years back, a song called Hard Living that radio just loved, but I don't think we sold very few records off that because it was kind of a departure for me in style, and my fans, I don't think, were real pleased with it. They could tap their foot to it, but they wouldn't go down to the record store and buy it.
When you say my fans, do you have a certain hardcore that will always buy your records regardless?
Well, they are right now. I hope they do. At this point in time, they're buying the records. But one thing I've noticed, the fans that we had prior to coming to Nashville were real happy with the success that we had initially with the records like Miami, Miami, and with 10 Feet Away and things like that. But I kept hearing over and over at my shows, well, we're so happy to be able to turn the radio on and hear your records, but we can't wait for you to start doing the kind of stuff that you do best, which was the more traditional country music, which I was doing before I even got involved in the bluegrass music.
Does a certain segment of your fans want you to sing bluegrass? Do they want to keep you in that bluegrass mold?
I'm sure there'll always be a few people that do, and there were a lot of people when I first came to town, because a lot of people were under the misconception I started out in bluegrass music. And I
What,
think
how did you start out?
started out in country music, almost exactly the kind of music that I'm playing right now. When I was 8 years old, I was appearing on the Buddy Starcher early morning TV show on WCHS in Charleston, West Virginia. And I did songs with, with steel guitar and drums and that type of arrangement. Did a lot of old Hank Williams, George Jones, Lefty Frizzell songs.
How did you get tagged as a bluegrass singer?
Well, the area that I lived in, I wanted more than anything else to be in a band. And the area that I lived in, there were a lot of excellent bluegrass bands. There were no steel guitar players, no drummers, anything like that. So in order to get in a band, I joined a bluegrass band that my brother Dwight had formed. And Dwight's an older brother of mine, an excellent banjo player. And I became interested in bluegrass music. I was a huge fan of the Stanley Brothers. We're talking about age 13 now, and I realize that's young for a lot of people, but I already had probably 7 or 8 years in the music business or performing under my belt at that time. And
When
shortly,
you were 13, you already had 7 or 8 years as a performer
right
under your belt?
Yeah, I started in contests and things like that at 4 and 5 years old, and then started doing TV and radio at about 7 or 8. I realize that's kind of young, but I was deeply rooted in... my mother had a lot of old records by people like Lefty and Hank and those type. Marty Robbins, I think the Marty Robbins Gunfighters Ballads was the first album that I remember buying. So that's really the kind of music that I like best, although I learned to love bluegrass music and feel that I learned a lot from it. I think the harmony structure that I use in my music right now is basically bluegrass style harmony, and I think it works real well with the type music that we do. And the question you were asking me about the fans, I think there will always be a few people out there, would prefer to hear me play bluegrass music, but I think now more and more they're finding out that I did start out in this kind of music, and they're beginning to accept it. There was a while that I hardly ever saw any of the old people that used to come out to my bluegrass concerts at my shows, but more and more now, with the release of the Don't Close Your Eyes album, which has a more acoustic flavor to it, we're getting more and more of those people out at our shows now, and they're really accepting what we do real well now, and I'm real pleased about that.
Keith, let's talk about your records. You came off of 1988 with the #1 record in the United States in country music. Don't Close Your Eyes.
We sure did.
So what's new for 1989?
Well, we have a brand new record that just came out, enters the charts here shortly, called I'm No Stranger to the Rain, which is another song from the Don't Close Your Eyes album.
And by the time this airs, it will be well on its way.
I hope so. It's a song that was written by Sonny Curtis and Ron Hillard, and it's kind of could be an autobiographical song for me, because it kind of deals with survival and battling one type of demon or another, and I've done my share of that, as I'm sure a lot of people have. And I'm real proud of this song. It's also the first up-tempo single that we've had from this album.
Is the rain in this case the demon?
No, it's not just the rain. I think rain is a term that they're using for some of the bad things that have happened in this person's life.
Well, those would be the demons then.
Oh, right, yeah. I thought you meant, was it really rain like we're having now?
No. It's raining as we tape this show. No, I'm talking about in terms of symbolism in the record.
Right, yeah, that's exactly right.
What sort of demons have you fought in your life?
The biggest demons that I've fought in my life were alcohol and drugs. I got into that real heavy, as I thought you had to do that to be in this business. But I found out that's the quickest way to get you out of this business and out of life in general. And I started out drinking at a very early age while I was performing. I never was one of those people who got real drunk and performed. I just learned to kind of rely on a little shot for courage to get on stage, and it, as it will do, started getting the best of me, and I came very close to wrecking my career and my life and everything. And,
do you think there are a lot of young singers trying to get to Nashville that think the same thing?
I sure do. That's the reason I went a long time and was afraid or hesitant to talk about the problems that I'd had with it. And then I found out that by doing it, it's good therapy for me, and also it may help somebody else who's sitting out there listening to the radio just like I used to do, and maybe has that same misconception that you have to be like some of your idols to be successful.
Interesting. Before I go, I want to explain something. From time to time in our interview segments, you hear a roar, and that's because where we're doing the interview, at my office, we're right by the Nashville airport, and those are planes flying right over. I'm visiting with Keith Whitley, who does a remarkably close impression of Lester Flatt. And, could we go into your Lester Flatt mode here to show them what I'm talking about?
Well, I don't have a whole lot of trouble going into that mode, Ralph. You know, it's kind of like it's just automatic, and I shift into it sometimes without having much control over it.
I know you sing Rub It In, the old Billy Crash Craddock song, As Lester
Flatt. I did another one on your show that I had forgotten about, too. It was, you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, as Lester Flatt. Do you remember that?
No.
I did that. Well, I had forgotten about it, and I was watching an old tape on the bus the other day. My bass player records all of my appearances on Nashville Now, and I was going through a tape of several different appearances, and I'm doing Lucille on one of the Nashville Now shows.
Did you do Lester before he died?
Oh, yeah. I had the pleasure of getting to know Lester Flatt real well. I was working with Ralph Stanley's band, and during the summer we would play the various bluegrass festivals all across the country. And it was the same package. You know, it would be Ralph Stanley, Lester Flatt, Bill Monroe, Don Reno, and several groups. And we would work together every weekend. So I traveled with Lester. You know, even though I wasn't a part of his show, we were always working together. And we got to be real good friends. And Lester was still in pretty good health at this time, and as a matter of fact, we became so close that he gave me an old guitar. It's a 1943 D28 Martin that he had used on a lot of the old Flatt and Scruggs records. This was in August of 1974. I remember the first time I played the guitar on stage, Ralph was following Lester on the show that day, and Lester came off the stage and handed me the guitar, still had his strap on it. So I worked up my imitation then, and he loved it. I mean, he would get me to do it for other people. You know, it really cracked him up. He'd come up to me and he would say,
Lester, how long you had that old guitar? I'd say, I've had it about 15 years now.
And he'd always slap his legs and laugh. You know, it really cracked him up.
Lester was on the air for years with Earl Scruggs for Martha White's Flower.
Goodness gracious, it's good.
Does his family resent your doing him?
No, I'm very happy to say I used to wonder how they would feel about that, because I do it out of love. I really loved Lester Flatt, and I think about him, miss him very dearly, and I didn't know how they would react to my impersonation until I did it on Nashville Now. And every time I do it on the show, I receive some really, really nice letters from some of the Flatt family around the Sparta area. Lester has, I think, two people in particular who write to me, and they've even sent me some songs, but they accept the impersonation in the spirit in which I do it, and they're always very flattered and very moved by it, and I really appreciate that.
I'll tell you, there are three people I can think of that do this pretty well. You and Ricky Scaggs and Sonny Osborne. Sonny can do he can do Earl Scruggs.
He does a great Earl Scruggs.
And he can do Monroe. That's Ricky always. Did you ever notice Ricky? He doesn't say Bill very, very often. He'll say Monroe.
Monroe. Monroe. That's what most all the people that are in bluegrass music or that come out of bluegrass music refer to Bill as Monroe.
Keith, I thank you.
Ralph, it's been a real pleasure.
I look forward to talking to you again.
Me too. I hope it's a little sooner than the time between our last visit.
Keith, how about doing a little Lester Flatt for me?
Thank you so much, Ralph. It's always a pleasure to get the chance to do a little bit of my old buddy, Lester Flatt. And as Lester used to say, goodness gracious, it's good to be here with you.